The sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting a dim glow over the small town of Glenwood. A light chill settled in the air as the group of friends gathered at their usual meeting spot near the outskirts of town. The familiar sounds of the evening, a distant dog barking, the rustling of leaves, felt almost comforting, yet something about the night felt different. They had been friends since childhood, bound by an unspoken understanding that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The group consisted of four. Emma, the practical one with an eye for detail. Ben, the adventurous soul, always seeking something new. Sarah, the quiet thinker who seemed to understand things others couldn't. And Alex, the joker, whose laughter could light up even the darkest of rooms. Together, they had always been inseparable, exploring every nook and cranny of Glenwood. But tonight, the air was thick with a sense of anticipation, the feeling that something unusual was about to happen. It all began with Ben, always the one to push boundaries. He had been wandering near the old train tracks when he stumbled upon an odd indentation in the ground. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a shallow hole. But upon closer inspection, he realized it was the entrance to something hidden beneath the earth. Intrigued, he dug a little, revealing a rusted metal door, partially buried in the earth, its edges jagged and worn with age. It seemed out of place, like a relic from another time. His curiosity piqued, Ben called the others, urging them to come see. Emma, who usually kept a level head, felt a strange unease as they stood in front of the door. She glanced around, her gaze sweeping over the familiar surroundings. There was something about the quiet that felt unnatural tonight, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Ben, ever the risk-taker, grinned. "What's the worst that could happen? It's probably just an old tunnel or something. We could explore and see where it leads." Despite her hesitation, Emma followed as the group gathered around the door. Alex, with his usual grin, cracked a joke about how they would probably find treasure down there. Sarah, silent as always, stood apart from the group, staring at the door with an intensity that unsettled the others. It was as though she knew something they didn't. "Are you coming?" Ben asked, already reaching for the rusted handle. Sarah nodded slowly. "I will, but something's not right. Be careful." The others exchanged uneasy glances before Ben pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing down the dark passage that lay beyond. The air that wafted from the tunnel smelled damp, musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. There was a deep silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps as they cautiously stepped inside. The tunnel stretched out before them, narrow and winding. It was lined with rough stone walls, the stones uneven and cold to the touch. The flickering light from their flashlights illuminated only a small portion of the dark passage ahead. But despite the eerie atmosphere, the friends pressed on, drawn by an inexplicable sense of curiosity. As they walked deeper into the tunnel, something strange began to happen. The walls of the tunnel seemed to shift, subtly at first, almost as if the path was changing before their eyes. The further they went, the more familiar everything started to feel. The walls, once rough and jagged, began to smooth out. The temperature seemed to rise slightly, as though they were no longer underground, but in a house, a home of sorts. At first, they dismissed it as their minds playing tricks on them, but as they moved forward, the tunnel began to resemble the interior of a house more and more. The stone walls turned into wooden paneling. The cold floor beneath their feet became a plush carpet. Their flashlights illuminated furniture, but there was no sign of life. Just remnants of a home long abandoned, an old armchair, a worn rug, a coffee table. The further they walked, the more it began to feel as though they were walking through a strange version of their own homes. "I don't know about this," Emma said, her voice low as she looked around, feeling a creeping sense of unease. "This feels wrong." Ben laughed nervously. "It's probably just a series of abandoned houses or something. People probably used this as a shortcut back in the day." But as they ventured deeper, the house-like features grew more specific. A hallway appeared ahead, one that seemed to mirror the layout of Emma's childhood home. The wallpaper, the furniture, the creaky floorboards, they were all eerily familiar. Ben's voice faltered as he pointed down the hall. "Isn't that your house, Emma?" he asked, his tone uncertain. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she stared down the hall. It couldn't be. It had to be a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the tunnel's oppressive atmosphere. But the hallway looked unmistakably like the one she had grown up in, every detail down to the antique mirror that hung on the wall. "Maybe it's a coincidence," she said quickly, but there was a tremor in her voice. They continued down the hall, their steps growing more hesitant. The surroundings became even more unsettling as they passed what looked like a living room. The furniture was identical to that of Sarah's home, down to the worn-out armchair by the fireplace. It was like walking through a dream, a distorted reflection of their own lives. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, her usually calm demeanor cracking. This isn't right." Just then a sound broke the silence, faint but unmistakable. It came from a door at the end of the hallway. The friends froze, their breath catching in their throats as the sound grew louder. It was a soft, scraping noise, as though something or someone was moving behind the door. Without thinking, Ben reached for the door handle. The others wanted to stop him, to pull him back, but something compelled them to follow as he slowly opened the door. What they saw made their blood run cold. Inside the room stood a figure hunched over, its back to them. It was an indistinct shape, but there was something about the way it moved that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The figure seemed to be rummaging through a dresser, unaware of the group standing in the doorway. Who is that?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Ben replied, his voice barely a breath. Then, as if sensing their presence, the figure froze. Slowly, it turned around, and in the dim light, the friends saw its face. It was a face they all recognized, each one of them staring back at them, distorted, twisted in a grotesque imitation of their own features. The figure's lips twisted into a mocking smile as it stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in as though the very tunnel itself was alive. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud, trapping them in a room with the twisted reflections of themselves. A voice, hollow and empty, echoed in their minds, but there was no sound, only the realization that they were not alone. There was something in the room with them, something they couldn't see, something that had been waiting for them all along. The door creaked open once again. They didn't dare move, not sure what they had seen or what would happen next. The truth was there, waiting for them in the suffocating darkness. They weren't just in some abandoned house. They were home. The group stood frozen, their hearts hammering in their chests, the reality of what they had just witnessed starting to sink in. The figure, whose features were twisted and distorted, had seemed so real. But that wasn't what terrified them the most. It was the feeling of familiarity, of recognition. It was as if the figure was a mirror image, an inverted version of themselves, but worse somehow. The room around them, once empty and abandoned, now felt alive, suffocating them with a thick, oppressive air. Ben's breath was shallow, his hand still on the doorknob. His fingers were numb, but he couldn't let go. He didn't want to see what would happen if he did. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath, the words barely escaping his lips. He had seen that face, those features, that expression, before. The silence was unbearable. The room felt like it was shrinking, pressing in on them with each passing second. Then, as if breaking free from a trance, Sarah stepped forward, her usually composed demeanor now shattered. "We need to get out of here, now!" But the door behind them, the one they had just come through, wasn't there anymore. The hallway, which had seemed so familiar moments ago, now stretched endlessly before them. The furniture, the fixtures, everything was the same, yet everything felt wrong, as if they were caught in some twisted version of reality. Emma looked around frantically, her heart racing in her chest. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the light fixtures dim and flickering. It felt like they were walking through a house that had been abandoned for years. But they knew it wasn't right. It couldn't be. This place had no right to feel this familiar. She glanced at Sarah, her wide eyes searching for some kind of reassurance. But Sarah wasn't looking at her. Sarah was staring at something else, at the door in front of them, the one with the label on it. Ben had noticed it too. The door was old, its wooden surface weathered and cracked, but it was the label that drew their attention. It was simple, neat, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately, and there, in bold black letters, was the name, Emma. The realization hit them like a wave crashing on the shore. Emma's name, her full name, etched into the door like a signpost, leading them deeper into the unknown. But it wasn't just any door. It was a door in this strange, distorted version of their town. A door that had no right to be here, leading to a place that shouldn't exist. "What the hell is this?" Ben whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Emma breathed, her voice barely audible. She didn't want to move, didn't want to face what lay behind that door, but something pulled her forward, something that made her reach out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, warped surface of the door. It felt like she had no choice but to open it. The air in the hallway was thick with tension, and the label on the door seemed to pulse with a dark energy, beckoning her to step through. Before she could make up her mind, Sarah grabbed her arm, pulling her back with surprising force. "Don't," she said, her voice firm, but her eyes wide with fear. "We don't know what's on the other side." Emma felt a pang of unease, but the temptation to know, to understand, was overwhelming. She needed to see what was behind that door. Without thinking, she wrenched her arm free, and before anyone could stop her, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The room inside was dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves stacked high with dusty, forgotten items. Old furniture lay scattered haphazardly around the room, furniture that, to Emma's horror, looked exactly like the ones in her own house. The air smelled musty, like a place that had been shut away for years, never disturbed. And there, in the center of the room, was a small bed. The sheets were neatly arranged, but the bed itself looked unnervingly familiar. Emma had slept in a bed just like that for most of her life, and it wasn't until now that she realized how disturbing it was to see it here, in a place that wasn't hers. She stepped forward, her breath quickening as the memories rushed back to her. The bed, her bed, was exactly the same, down to the faded quilt her grandmother had made for her when she was a child. But there was something else in the room, too. Something that made her skin crawl. On the wall, just above the bed, hung a picture frame. The photo inside was old and yellowed with age, but it wasn't the age of the picture that sent chills down her spine. It was the faces in the picture. Her family, standing together in front of the house, smiling like any normal family would. But in the background, just barely visible, there was a shadow, a dark, shifting figure that seemed to stare directly at her. She stepped back, her stomach twisting in knots. This isn't my room," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was trying to convince. "It can't be." The others had followed her into the room, and they now stood in the doorway, staring at the same picture on the wall. Ben's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That's your family," he said quietly. Emma nodded, but her mind was racing. The figure in the picture, it hadn't been there before. She would have noticed it, right? Or had it always been there, lurking just out of sight? Had she somehow forgotten about it? "I think we need to leave," Sarah said, her voice urgent, but Emma could see the fear in her eyes. She could feel it too, the growing sense of dread that was seeping into her bones. But before Emma could respond, she heard it. A soft creak, like a floorboard giving way coming from behind her. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the picture standing behind her. But the room was empty. It wasn't the emptiness that scared her, though. It was the feeling that someone was watching them from the corners of the room, hiding just out of sight. "What is that?" Alex asked, his voice cracking. The others turned, following his gaze to the far corner of the room. There, barely visible in the dim light, was another door. This one was different, much smaller, almost child-sized. It had no label, no name, just a dark, imposing presence that sent a chill through their spines. Without speaking, Emma felt herself drawn toward it, as if the door was calling to her. She didn't want to go, but she couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her closer and closer to the door. "No, Emma," Ben whispered urgently, reaching for her arm, but she was already there. The handle was cold to the touch, and as she gripped it, she heard a soft sound, a voice faint and distant, as though it were coming from beyond the door. Her hand hesitated on the knob, but then she turned it. The door swung open with a soft groan, and the room beyond was revealed. It wasn't like the others. It was small, cramped, and dark, the air thick with dust. But what caught her attention was the object in the center of the room. A small wooden chest, no bigger than a suitcase, sat on the floor. Its surface was worn, the wood scratched and faded, but the lock, it was new, gleaming and untouched, as if someone had recently placed it there. Without thinking, Emma dropped to her knees, her fingers trembling as she reached for the lock. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that whatever was inside that chest was important. She needed to see it. But before she could touch the lock, a sharp sound broke the silence, a sound that made her blood run cold, a slow, deliberate breathing coming from the far corner of the room. She wasn't alone. The door slammed shut behind her. The darkness pressed in on Emma as she turned, her heart racing. The air was thick, suffocating, as if every breath she took only made the shadows grow heavier. She could feel the presence in the room now, a palpable, creeping force that seemed to watch her from every corner. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been alone for a long time. The soft, rhythmic breathing continued, low and slow, like something or someone was waiting for her to make the first move. Emma could feel the sweat beading on her brow, her palms clammy as she struggled to hold onto the lock of the chest, which now seemed impossibly distant. With every passing second, the room seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in. She heard the faint scuffling of feet behind her, the sound so subtle it could have been the wind, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through her. Her pulse quickened, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get out, to escape before whatever was in the room with her could reach her. But she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the chest. The lock shimmered under the dim light, so close, yet still out of reach. "Emma, stop!" came a voice low and gravelly, as though it had been dragged from the depths of the earth. It was a voice she knew, though she hadn't heard it in years. She whirled around, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the far corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, was the figure of a man. His face was obscured by the darkness, but she could see the outline of his frame. The same height, the same build, the same presence. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it just stood there, watching her with an expression that was both familiar and utterly alien. The man she had once called father had died when she was only 15, and yet here he was, standing in the corner of a room in a forgotten tunnel beneath the town she had grown up in. The room seemed to spin around her as she tried to process what she was seeing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be him. And yet, everything about the figure, his posture, his eyes, the way he stood so perfectly still, felt like him. "Why are you here?" Emma asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, her throat dry. The figure didn't speak, but she could feel his presence growing stronger, more intense, until it became an overwhelming force. He took a step forward, and with it, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, like the air itself had turned to ice. The shadows seemed to gather around him, swirling in a vortex that seemed to pull everything toward him. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, her mind reeling as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She wasn't in her childhood home anymore. This wasn't a place she recognized, but somehow it felt like it was drawing from everything she had ever known. Every corner of her life, every memory, the house, the familiar rooms, The echoes of laughter that once filled the air, all of it had come together in this nightmarish convergence. Suddenly, the figure spoke, his voice echoing in her mind rather than in the room. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma," it said. "This place, it was never meant for you." The words sent a chill through her, freezing her in place. The chest, the lock, the room, it was all connected, she realized, as if everything had been building toward this moment. This was the place where everything came together, where memories and shadows collided. You're not real," Emma managed to say, but the words felt weak, hollow. A low laugh, soft and almost sad, echoed from the figure. "I'm as real as you want me to be." The shadows in the room seemed to ripple, as though reacting to the words. The walls creaked and groaned, as though the entire space itself was alive, shifting and pulsating with an unnatural energy. The air grew thicker, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You wanted to know the truth," the figure continued, stepping closer. "This place, these rooms, they aren't just reflections of your world. They are your world, your fears, your memories, your deepest desires. This tunnel, this house, it exists because of you, because of all of you." Emma's mind raced as she tried to comprehend what he was saying. The tunnel, the strange doors, the mirror images of their homes. It was all connected to them, to their lives. But how and why? "You've all been here before, Emma, long before tonight, long before you even realized it." The room seemed to shift again, the shadows twisting into shapes that no longer resembled anything familiar. Her father's figure, if it was really him, dissolved into the darkness, his outline vanishing like smoke. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as the room began to pulse, the chest before her now glowing with a faint, eerie light. The lock on the chest clicked as though releasing some unseen tension, and the lid slowly creaked open. Something shifted in the air, something cold and heavy. The chest was empty. There was nothing inside it. But that didn't matter, because as the chest opened, Emma's mind exploded with visions, flashes of moments she had long buried. She saw her childhood home, but it was wrong. The rooms were all twisted, distorted. People she had known, her friends, her family, were there, but they weren't the same. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, as if they were all trapped in some kind of endless loop. And then through it all, there was the figure of the man, her father, standing at the center, his face a blur, his hands reaching out to her. "Why are you showing me this?" Emma cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. She couldn't make sense of the images, the memories blending together in a disorienting whirl. It was as if she were being pulled into a world that wasn't her own, a world made of nothing but the fragments of her mind. The shadows closed in again, the room shrinking around her. She tried to move, to run, but the space felt endless, a loop that stretched out into the dark. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and the air grew more suffocating. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The shadows receded. The temperature returned to normal. The oppressive feeling that had filled the room lifted. Emma stood there, gasping for breath, her body trembling. Her mind was a blur of confusion and fear, unable to grasp what had just happened. The chest in front of her was now closed, its lock sealed once more, as though it had never been opened. And then she heard it, a faint voice, barely a whisper, coming from behind her. "Emma." She turned around, her heart in her throat. Standing in the doorway of the room, looking at her with wide, fearful eyes, was Sarah. Ben and Alex stood just behind her, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. Emma blinked, trying to focus. The tunnel, the house, the chest. Everything seemed to fade into the background as she saw her friend standing there, alive, real. They had been in the tunnel with her, hadn't they? She wasn't alone, but they weren't the same either. Something in their expressions had changed. They looked as if they had seen something terrible, something they hadn't been able to escape. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What just happened? What is this place?" Emma didn't know how to answer. She couldn't explain it. She didn't understand it herself. The house, the memories, the shadows. It was all connected, but in a way that defied logic. There was no way to make sense of it. But one thing was clear. They had to leave. And so, without another word, the four of them turned and fled, running down the endless hallway, through the rooms that seemed to stretch forever. The tunnel behind them seemed to collapse, the doors slamming shut as if they were being sealed away, locking them out of whatever nightmare they had just escaped. Finally, they emerged into the cool night air, their feet hitting the ground as they stumbled out of the tunnel. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. But as they walked away from the entrance, as the distant lights of their town flickered in the distance, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. Something was still waiting, just beyond the edges of their world, in the place where shadows and memories twisted together. And she knew deep down that they hadn't escaped it. Not really. The house, the tunnel, it was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for them to return.